On Monday, August 9, 1971, a private cable arrived at the United States Treasury from London. The British government wanted to convert approximately $3 billion of its dollar reserves, the money Britain's central bank kept as savings, into American gold. At the price the United States had publicly guaranteed every nation in the world since the end of the Second World War. The men who received that cable already knew the answer. The United States did not have the gold. Not $3 billion worth. Not at the promised price. And if Britain found out, if any country found out, the line of nations demanding the same exchange would empty the American vault before the week was over. Within 4 days, 15 men were summoned in total secrecy to a presidential retreat in the woods of Maryland. They were not told what they were going to discuss. Their phone calls were monitored. They were instructed to tell no one where they were going, not even their wives. They had 3 days. By Sunday night, they had to decide whether the United States was going to honor the most important financial promise it had ever made, or break it on national television. Only one man in that room would argue they should keep the promise. He was overruled before the weekend was over. This is Black Box Markets. Let's open the black box. How does a country that promised the world its gold simply run out? How does the richest economy on Earth, the anchor of the entire global financial system, find itself unable to honor the most important commitment it ever made? To answer that, you have to start in 1944, in a resort hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire. The Second World War was almost over. Europe was rubble. Every major industrial economy, except the United States, had spent itself into ruin paying for the war. Factories destroyed, currencies worthless, treasuries empty. Whatever monetary system the world had used before 1939 was finished. Something new had to be built. In July of 1944, representatives from 44 countries traveled to a town called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design that new system. What they agreed to was simple in concept and explosive in consequence. Imagine for a moment that you walked into a bank holding a piece of paper. The paper says you can hand it back anytime you want and walk out with a fixed amount of gold, exactly $35 per ounce, never more, never less. The bank guarantees it. The whole world guarantees it. That paper is not just paper. It is a receipt for gold sitting in a vault. That is what every US dollar was after Bretton Woods. Every country in the world tied the value of its currency to the dollar. And the United States, in exchange for being the anchor of the entire system, tied the dollar itself to gold at a price that would not move. Forever. Any dollar a foreign government held could be brought to the US Treasury and exchanged for a fixed quantity of gold. No questions asked, no exceptions made. That single promise was the foundation of the global monetary system for the next 27 years. For a while, it worked. The American economy was producing more than it consumed. Dollars flowed out into the world to pay for American goods. Foreign governments held those dollars confidently, knowing that, if they ever wanted to, they could line up at the door of the US Treasury and trade them for American gold. Then the math began to bend. The United States started spending money it did not have. The Vietnam War was expensive. President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, expanded welfare, were expensive. Rather than raise taxes to pay for any of it, the US government did what every government does when it does not want to make hard choices. It printed dollars. For most countries, printing money cheapens the currency at home through inflation. But the United States was not most countries. It was the anchor of the global system. Every dollar it printed went somewhere, and that somewhere, more often than not, was the central bank of a foreign government, which now held one more paper receipt that, in theory, could still be exchanged for American gold. By the late 1960s, the gap between what America had promised and what it could actually deliver had become impossible to ignore. American gold reserves had fallen from about $25 billion at the end of the war to roughly $10 billion. Meanwhile, foreign governments held nearly $40 billion in U.S. currency, every dollar of which, in theory, could still be presented at the Treasury and exchanged for gold America did not have. Roughly $4 of foreign claims for every dollar of gold behind them. To picture what that means, picture a coat check at a stadium that has handed out 4 claim tickets for every coat hanging on the rack. As long as no one shows up to actually retrieve their coat, no one notices that the math is impossible. The moment one person asks for theirs and tells the next person what happened, every other ticket holder rushes the counter at once. There is a name for that, in finance and out of it. It is called a run. By 1971, the United States had been quietly running a bank that had handed out 4 times more receipts than the gold it kept in the vault. And every senior banker in every major economy in the world knew it. The question was, who would move first? The first government to move was France. In the mid-1960s, French President Charles de Gaulle made a public decision that astonished the United States. France would begin systematically converting its dollar reserves into gold and physically transporting that gold across the Atlantic, away from American vaults and into French ones. The trades were not done quietly, they were done loudly. De Gaulle wanted the world to see French gold being shipped home from New York Harbor week after week. He was making a statement. He was telling every other government in the world, in language no one could miss, that he believed the American promise was a check that could not be cashed, and that he wanted French gold out of American hands before the bank closed its doors. Other countries watched. Some quietly began doing the same thing. By the start of 1971, the trickle of gold leaving American vaults had become a steady drain. Inside the U.S. Treasury, the men managing the country's gold understood, better than anyone outside the building, that the promise made at Bretton Woods could not be honored much longer. What they did not have was a plan for what to do when the run came. The run came on August 9th. The British cable was not a public demand. It was a quiet inquiry, an Allied government sounding out the Treasury about the mechanics of converting British dollar holdings into American gold. The amount being discussed was approximately $3 billion, large enough that, on its own, it would have eaten through nearly a third of America's remaining gold reserves in a single transaction. But what frightened the men in the Treasury was not the size of the British request, it was what would happen next. If Britain converted, every other government in the world would learn within hours. Every one of them would do the same thing, because no central bank wanted to be the last country in line at a vault that was about to run dry. The first country to demand its gold would receive it. The last country in line would receive nothing. The United States was about to face a run on its own treasury. It had 4 days to decide what to do. On Friday, August 13, 1971, 15 men arrived at Camp David, the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains, a short helicopter flight from Washington. They had been summoned with no explanation. The press was told nothing. Phones were restricted. The men inside were instructed that anything they said over the weekend would be classified as a national security matter, and that no word of the meeting was to leave the compound. The president was there, Richard Nixon. His Treasury Secretary was there, a former Texas governor, oil industry insider, and political brawler who had been in the job less than 9 months, John Connally. Connally had no formal training in international finance. What he had was an absolute willingness to act decisively in front of cameras, and a private contempt for the European governments he believed had spent 2 decades freeloading on American economic discipline. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, the bank that controls how much money exists inside the United States, was there, Arthur Burns. The director of the Federal Budget Office, a man who would later become Treasury Secretary himself, was there, George Shultz. And the man whose entire career had been spent studying exactly the kind of crisis that was about to unfold, who knew the mathematics of the gold standard better than anyone else in the room, was there, Paul Volcker. These were the men who would decide. The question on the table was simple. The United States could not honor its gold promise much longer. There were three options. The first was to negotiate, to call every major ally, Britain, France, West Germany, Japan, and try to coordinate an orderly, managed end to the Bretton Woods system. This would take months. It would require the cooperation of governments that had been quietly losing faith in American promises for years, and it would expose in real time exactly how desperate the United States had become. The second was to do nothing, to wait for the run to break in public and then react. The third was to act first, to suspend the gold promise unilaterally, without warning, without consultation, on a Sunday night, and present the world with a fait accompli, to break the agreement before anyone outside the building knew it was being broken. Which would you have chosen, knowing what they knew? Knowing the run was already starting? Knowing that even an honest negotiation with your allies would take months, and that you had days? Connolly argued for the third option, hard. He framed it as a matter of American power. The United States had been the anchor of the global system for a generation. It was time to remind every other country in the world that the rules of money were whatever the United States said they were. Burns, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, argued against it. He warned that closing the gold window, that is, refusing to convert any more dollars into gold, would shatter international confidence in the dollar, accelerate inflation at home, and damage every alliance the United States depended on. He was overruled by Sunday afternoon. The decision now had to be packaged for the public, and the men inside Camp David understood something important about how news works. If President Nixon went on television and announced only that the United States was abandoning its promise to convert dollars into gold, a promise most Americans had never even heard of, the headline the next morning would be one thing only: America defaulted. So they wrapped the announcement in two louder ones. A 90-day wage and price freeze, meaning that for 3 months no employer in the country could give a raise and no business could raise its prices, the most aggressive peacetime intervention in the American economy since the New Deal. And a 10% surcharge on imports, a tax on foreign goods coming into the country, designed to look like protection for American workers, but actually intended to pressure trading partners into accepting a lower dollar value. The gold announcement, the one that would actually rewrite the global monetary system, was the third item on the list. It was not the headline. It was the one buried in the middle. On Sunday night, August 15, 1971, at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Nixon went on national television and interrupted that evening's broadcast of Bonanza, the most watched show in America at the time, to address the country. He spoke for less than 20 minutes. He framed the announcement as a temporary measure to defend the dollar against international speculators. He used the word temporary repeatedly. Why? Because if the public heard the word permanent, if any American watching at home understood that the United States was actually walking away from a promise it had made to the world after the war, the panic would arrive at the bank doors the next morning instead of 50 years later. The American public heard about the wage and price controls. American newspapers led the next morning with the freeze. The international press, and the central banks of every major country in the world, understood instantly what had actually happened. The United States had closed the gold window. The promise made at Bretton Woods was, as of that Sunday night, void. It was supposed to be temporary. It was never reopened. In December of 1971, the United States and its major trading partners signed the Smithsonian Agreement, named after the museum in Washington where the deal was struck. It devalued the dollar from $35 per ounce of gold to $38 and tried to preserve a modified version of the fixed exchange rate system the Camp David weekend had broken. It collapsed within 15 months. By March of 1973, every major currency in the world had been cut loose from any fixed reference. Dollars, pounds, marks, yen, they all began to float against each other. To float, in this context, just means the price moves freely, up one day, down the next. Set not by treaty, not by law, but by whoever was buying and selling at any given second. The era of stable money, the world Bretton Woods had built, was over. What replaced it is the world we live in now, a world where currencies move every second, where central banks fight inflation by raising and cutting interest rates because they no longer have a fixed gold price to defend, where the United States can run deficits other countries can never match, because the dollar, despite no longer being convertible to anything physical at all, somehow remained the world's reserve currency anyway. The reserve currency, the money most countries in the world use to trade with each other. And here is the question worth sitting with. Why did the world keep using a currency that was no longer backed by anything? Bretton Woods had assumed, almost as a law of nature, that a currency could only anchor the global system if it was backed by something real. After August 15, 1971, the dollar was not backed by anything except the United States government's word. And the world kept using it anyway, because by then, the dollar was not in the system. It was the system. There was nothing else big enough to replace it. A few months after the weekend at Camp David, John Connolly explained the new reality to a room of European finance ministers in a single sentence that has been quoted ever since. "The dollar is our currency," he told them, "but it's your problem." That is what the black box of August 1971 contains. Not a bold policy decision, a controlled default by a country that had run out of gold, owed 4 times more than it could pay, and chose to break a 27-year promise on a Sunday night before any of its creditors could line up at the door. The 15 men at Camp David did not end the gold standard because they had a better idea. They closed the gold window because they were minutes away from a run they could not stop. They wrapped the announcement in a wage freeze and a tariff because the truth that America could not honor its own currency was too dangerous to say out loud. The promise was broken on national television. The decision had been made days earlier, in a room with no cameras, by men who knew the alternative was a panic the United States could no longer survive. Subscribe if you want to keep opening them.